In the vast and brutal landscape of Scandinavia, where mist mingles with the icy breath of the fjords, an ancient force manifested itself, not in gods or monsters, but in men. Official history will tell you that Berserker rage was merely a myth, a tale meant to frighten enemies, but the truth is much darker and more fascinating. What if what you know about the Vikings is just the tip of the iceberg? What if the force that made them warlords wasn't just steel, but an uncontrollable madness, a pact with chaos itself? Brace yourself, because we're about to delve into the depths of berserkgangr, a trance-like state that transformed men into invulnerable war machines and then left them ghosts of their former selves. If this story of mysticism, brutality, and tragedy captivates you, if this knowledge makes you see the Vikings in a new light, leave a like so more people can unravel this mystery. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this epic saga. Share with anyone who loves Norse history and tell me in the comments, where are you watching this epic journey from? The northern lands, shrouded in mist and the constant threat of cold, were not a place for the weak. Before berserkers became the epitome of terror and strength, Viking society was already forged in the steel of war and the harsh toil of the land. Life was brutal, and the status of a man, or an entire clan, depended directly on their ability to defend their possessions and expand their domains. War was not merely a means, but a fundamental part of existence. A warrior's worth was measured by their scars, by the legends told around the campfire, and, above all, by the honor they brought to their family and their jarl. Norse mythology, with its pantheon of warrior gods, fueled this culture. Odin, the Allfather, was the patron of war, wisdom, and death. His halls in Valhalla welcomed the bravest warriors, the Einherjar, who had died with honor in battle. The expectation of a glorious end, of joining Odin for Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was the greatest motivation for a Viking to take up arms. In this scenario, the warrior was more than a soldier. He was a pillar of society. There was a clear hierarchy, with jarls chiefs leading attacks, and their huskarls elite guards ensuring safety and loyalty. But military strength was not always enough to intimidate enemies or secure a decisive victory. Tension was constant. Disputes over land, raids on rival villages, and maritime expeditions in search of new riches. Courage was valued, but what was to come was something that transcended mere bravery. A type of warrior was about to be born who not only fought, but became the very embodiment of divine fury. They would not be just men, but manifestations of primordial chaos, and their arrival would forever change the face of Norse warfare. The Viking world was on the brink of transformation, and the legend of the Berserkers was about to be forged in blood and madness, a power that no one, not even the gods, seemed capable of controlling. The history of Berserkers begins not on a battlefield, but in whispered words and chants sung around the campfire. The legend of the berserkgangr, the Berserker rage, is as old as the sagas that recorded it. Its origins are believed to predate the Viking Age, a nebulous period when the line between man and beast was blurred and the world was still ruled by primal forces. Legend tells us that these warriors were not simply trained, but chosen or even cursed with strength that came from a supernatural source. They were the elite of an army, a symbol of power and a closely guarded secret. The first documented mentions of this rage are found in Scandinavian poems and Icelandic sagas, such as the Saga of Egil Skallagrimsson and the Saga of the Inglings, which date back centuries but narrate events that occurred much earlier. In these texts, berserkers are described with a mixture of admiration and dread. They're not just warriors, but something more, something approaching the monstrous. The sagas, while our primary source of information, also leave us with a number of unanswered questions, as their narrative nature blends fact and folklore. In Snorri Sturluson's Saga of the Inglings, there is a particularly notable passage that speaks directly to the rage of the berserkers. The text describes Odin's men as those who went without mail, mad as dogs or wolves, and bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or bulls. They killed men, but neither fire nor steel hurt them, and this was called berserker rage. This vivid and terrifying description solidified the image of berserkers in the popular mind. However, it is crucial to note that the very nature of a saga, an epic story told orally and later recorded, means that it can be embellished, exaggerated, and idealized. What we do know is that for the Vikings, this rage was not just a combat strategy. It was a state of being, a divine possession that set them apart from all other warriors. They were the embodiment of chaos in the order of war, a legend that would become a terrifying reality for their enemies. From these myths, the figure of the Berserker emerged from the shadows of legend onto the battlefield, ready to leave its indelible mark on history. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the smell of damp earth and the metal of dozens of weapons. The Saxon village of Lindisfarne, unprepared for the approaching storm, was silent before the terror. Atop a hill, the Viking legion lined up, their banners bearing Odin's raven fluttering in the wind. But in the center of the formation, everyone's attention was focused on a small, shadowy group. They wore no helmets or chainmail, only bear and wolf skins. Their muscles, taut and exposed, seemed bulging with inhuman strength. Their breathing was labored, almost animalistic, and their bloodshot eyes stared down at the village below. The leader, a burly man with a braided beard, let out a guttural scream that belonged to no human being. It was a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, a mixture of an animal's growl and the wail of a tortured soul. This was the signal. The berserkgangr had begun. As fury consumed them, their bodies began to tremble. They bit their shields, a frenzied ritual that seemed more a display of pure insanity than strategy. White foam formed on their lips, their eyes empty of humanity. They didn't run. They advanced. A wave of raw, uncontrollable violence, the first to arrive and the last to retreat. While the rest of the Viking army launched into the attack with lethal discipline, the berserkers were chaos incarnate. One of them, with the neck of a woman, charges into battle, shouting, "Odin wants me. Valhalla calls me." He ignores the arrows that strike him, which seem to simply bounce off his skin. With a two-handed axe, he attacks the first line of Saxon defense. His blow is so powerful that a Saxon warrior's weapon is thrown meters away. The terrified Saxon defender shouts to his men, "It's not a man, it's a beast." The berserkers break through the defenses with terrifying ease. They care nothing for their own protection, believing themselves invulnerable, immune to the cut of steel. What for other warriors was a fight for survival, for them was a dance of death, a sacred ritual to their god of war. The screams of terror and wails mingled with the clang of axes and the clash of shields. The sight of them was enough to break the morale of any army. Lindisfarne would not only be sacked, it would be consumed by the primal, uncontrollable force of berserker rage, a terrifying memory that would echo throughout Europe. Berserker rage was seen not simply as an advantage in combat, but as a sacred connection to the divine. Norse mythology, which permeated every aspect of Viking life, provided the basis for this belief. Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and poetry, was the patron saint of berserkers. Legend held that they were the god's closest warriors, his chosen champions, blessed with strength and invulnerability that transcended human capabilities. It was no coincidence that they entered battle without heavy armor. They believed that Odin himself protected them with an invisible cloak of invincibility. Rage, therefore, was not random madness, but a state of mystical exaltation, a divine possession. The berserkers saw themselves as the Einherjar of Earth, the elite warriors who fought for the Allfather even before reaching Valhalla. Their ultimate purpose was not just victory, but the glory of an honorable death, which would guarantee them a place beside Odin at the great banquet of heroes. This belief was the backbone of their courage, allowing them to fight with suicidal ferocity. For them, death in combat was the ultimate reward, not the end. The call to battle was not just a summons to combat, but an invitation to join the gods. This connection to the divine distinguished them from common warriors and created a reverential awe. The sagas, such as the Saga of the Inglings, reinforced this idea, describing Odin as the one who made them mad, and they fought without mail, mad as dogs or wolves, and bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or bulls. They killed men, but neither fire nor steel hurt them. This unshakable faith in Odin and his protection bestowed upon them an aura of invincibility that, in itself, was a powerful psychological weapon. Enemies, faced with these warriors who seemed immune to pain and fear, often lost their morale before even striking the first blow. Belief in the pact with Odin was not just a legend, but a tactic, a way of using religion to instill fear and dominate the battlefield. This fusion of belief and brutality is what made the Berserkers so unique and terrifying, transforming war from a physical struggle into a spectacle of faith and fury. Fury was, ultimately, the link between the mortal world and the world of the gods, a bridge of blood and glory to Valhalla. The transformation from a common warrior to a berserker was not a matter of simple choice. While historical sources are sparse on the exact details, sagas and folklore suggest that the path to becoming one of these elite warriors was long and fraught with rigorous and, in many cases, brutal rituals. There was no school for berserkers. Instead, initiation seemed to be a mystical and personal process, often led by a shaman, a jarl with archaic knowledge, or a more experienced berserker. These rituals, aimed at purification and connection with animal spirits, were key to awakening the berserker's rage. The initiation process began with a period of isolation. The aspiring berserker was taken to the forest, far from civilization, to live in communion with nature. The idea was that by separating himself from the order of society, he could reconnect with the chaotic and wild force that resided within him. During this period, he fasted, meditated, and underwent extreme physical trials. These rituals are believed to have included exposure to freezing temperatures, the ingestion of certain substances, and participation in mock combat where pain was a crucial part of the learning process. The goal was to forge not only the body, but also the mind, until the distinction between sanity and madness became blurred. An essential part of initiation was the search for a spiritual connection with the bear or wolf, the berserkers' totem animals. It was during this period that the aspirant hunted and wore the animal's skin, an act that symbolized the assimilation of its spirit. The skin was not just clothing, but a mystical cloak, a second self that would protect him and grant him the animal's strength. The ritual culminated in a final test, where the initiate was forced to face an extreme challenge, such as a solo battle against a superior enemy or a ritual duel. Success in this test was proof that he had mastered his rage and become worthy of the title of Berserker. However, it is important to emphasize that the lack of archaeological evidence or detailed accounts of rituals makes this part of the story more of a conjecture based on myth and legend. Regardless of the details, the Berserker initiation was a process that transformed men into something more, a bridge between the human and the animal world, between reason and rage. And for the few who completed this journey, the reward was the strength and invulnerability that would make them living legends. In the Viking world, a warrior's clothing was a symbol of his status, loyalty, and history. But for berserkers, the fur they wore was much more than a simple adornment or battle uniform. The bearskin, the origin of the word berserker, or wolfskin for the Ulfnar, was central to their identity and power. It was believed that by donning the skin of a wild animal, the warrior was not only covering himself, but also transforming himself, absorbing the creature's spirit and strength. The choice of a bear or a wolf was not random. The bear was revered in Norse culture as a symbol of strength, brutality, and ferocity. A raging bear was a force of nature, and the idea of a warrior who could channel that strength was both terrifying and inspiring. The wolf, in turn, was associated with cunning, speed, and packwork. The Ulfnar, the wolfskins, were warriors who channeled the ferocity and predatory nature of the wolf. Together, the two groups represented the duality of war, brute force, and predatory instinct. These skins weren't just clothing. They were what made them animal warriors. Berserkers went into battle without the protection of chainmail, relying not on metal, but on the mystical power of the skin they wore and the protection of Odin. The sight of a berserker in battle was in itself a psychological blow. The sight of a man in a bear's skin, screaming and biting his shield, unarmored and seemingly invulnerable to fear, was enough to shatter the morale of any army. Bear or wolf skins were a declaration that the warrior had transcended his humanity, becoming a force of nature. They were a symbol of his connection to primordial chaos and his pact with the divine. The importance of clothing, therefore, lay not in physical protection, but in mystical protection and psychological intimidation. It was the skin that defined the berserker, not the other way around. The concept of animal warriors was not exclusive to the berserkers, the bear warriors. Parallel to them were the Ulftinar, the wolfskins, who, like the berserkers, channeled the ferocity of an animal into battle. Although the sagas often mention them together, their characteristics and the way they manifested their fury were distinct, reflecting the nature of the animals they represented. While the berserkers embodied the brute strength and uncontrollable fury of a charging bear, the Ulfnar embodied the cunning, speed, and predatory cruelty of a wolf pack. The connection between these warriors and animals was not only symbolic but also spiritual. They were believed to enter a trance-like state where the warrior's soul merged with that of the animal. Berserker rage in this context was a type of animal possession. Berserkers, with their overwhelming strength and ability to absorb damage, were ideal for breaking through enemy defenses, acting as an unstoppable vanguard. In contrast, the Ulfnar were more tactical and strategic. They attacked in groups, flanking the enemy and using the speed and coordination of a pack to sow chaos and disorder. The description of biting their shields, while often associated with berserkers, also applied to the Ulfnar, an act that mimicked the behavior of a rabid animal and served as a ritual preparation for the rage. The existence of both groups side by side reflects the complexity of the Viking war mentality. It was not just one way to be an elite warrior. There was the path of brute strength and the path of animal cunning. The presence of the Ulfnar, though less prominent in the better-known sagas, confirms that the idea of an animal warrior was a concept rooted in Norse culture, something that transcended mere war tactics to become a manifestation of belief. The figure of the animal warrior was a link between the world of men and the wild, a constant reminder that Viking civilization, though expanding, was never far from its primitive origins and the savagery of nature. And for those who faced them, the sight of men transforming into beasts on the battlefield was what made them more feared than any other warrior. The psychological impact and ferocity of berserkers in battle were not simply a result of their appearance or fame, but of a real and terrifying advantage that fury conferred upon them. In their berserking state, warriors experienced a profound alteration in their perception of reality, granting them inhuman strength and an insensitivity to pain. Sagas and chronicles describe how they seemed invulnerable, continuing on even after being struck by swords or arrows. What would be a fatal wound for a common warrior was merely a scratch for a berserker. This immunity to pain was one of the most striking aspects of the fury. The adrenaline and altered consciousness caused by the trance-suppressed pain signals, allowing them to fight for long periods without feeling the weight of their injuries. This doesn't mean they didn't get hurt, but it did mean their injuries didn't stop them. They might have a broken arm or deep cuts, but they would keep moving forward, a spectacle that completely demoralized the enemy. Fear, pain, and exhaustion, which are a warrior's greatest limiters, simply didn't exist for them. Furthermore, rage also gave them a noticeable increase in physical strength. They were capable of striking blows with a power unmatched by a normal man. The weight of their axes and swords was magnified, and a single blow could be enough to shatter a shield or pierce through armor. This immense strength, combined with their lack of fear of pain, made them ideally suited to the vanguard role. They were the spearhead of the Viking army, the striking force that cut through enemy defenses, creating gaps for the rest of the troops to advance. One saga account, though perhaps exaggerated, describes a berserker capable of single-handedly facing and defeating 12 men. This ability, combined with their reputation for being protected by Odin, made their mere presence a threat in itself. They were the embodiment of victory, and their rage was the engine that drove the success of their jarls and kings. Fury was, in essence, a Norse superpower, a gift from the gods that transformed men into war machines. The Viking battlefield was a noisy place, filled with the clang of steel, the clash of shields, and the war cries of armies. Yet there was one sound that stood out, a sound that alone was capable of sowing panic in the enemy ranks. This was the war cry of the berserkers. It was not a cry of motivation, but a sound of fury and madness, a warning that sanity had been abandoned and that death was on the way. This scream wasn't simply a battle cry. It was a ritual, an intrinsic part of the warrior's transformation into a berserker. It began with a low, guttural growl, reminiscent of a bear's roar or a wolf's howl. As the fury grew, the sound intensified, evolving into a scream that seemed to rip from the throat. It was a sound that seemed to come not from a human being, but from something older, more savage. This scream was the last manifestation of the human before the animal took over, the final transition into the berserking state. The cry had a dual purpose. For the allies, It was a signal that Odin's champions were on the field. Just hearing this sound was enough to fill the Vikings' hearts with new courage and a sense of impending victory. They knew the vanguard of the attack was protected, and that the enemy defenses were about to be breached. For the enemies, however, it was terrifying. The sound echoed across the battlefield, a warning that they were about to face an irrational and unstoppable force. It was a cry that brought madness and death in its wake, and many warriors, upon hearing it, lost their courage and fled before the first blow was even struck. The Berserkers' war cry was more than a form of communication. It was a psychological weapon. It was the sonic embodiment of fear, the voice of uncontrollable fury. It heralded not just attack, but complete and total annihilation. The legend of this terrifying cry is as crucial to the history of the Berserkers as their fury and invulnerability. It was their defining sound, the chaotic symphony of war that resounded through the ages. The memory of this cry would linger long after the echoes of battle had died away, reminding all of the terror Odin's animal warriors could inflict. Berserker rage didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a process, a transition that manifested itself through unmistakable physical and mental signs. Before full fury took hold of the warrior, he entered a state the Sagas describe as battle fever. It was a period of controlled madness, a harbinger of what was to come, where the body and mind prepared for the possession of fury. This state was characterized by a series of symptoms that made the warrior an even more terrifying figure even. Before the combat began, the first sign was trembling. The berserker's body would begin to shake uncontrollably, a tremor not of fear, but of pent-up energy seeking release. Their breathing became labored and heavy, like that of a cornered animal, and saliva accumulated in their mouths, resulting in foam running down their lips. Their eyes became bloodshot, and reason seemed to fade, replaced by a primal rage. In this state, they might bite their shields, an act that served no practical purpose but served as a ritual of preparation, a channel to release pent-up energy and enter a trance. The sight of these men panting, salivating, and trembling with fury was enough to unsettle any enemy. Battle fever was a transitional state. It was the phase in which the warrior abandoned his humanity and surrendered to chaos. The sagas describe this state with a mixture of fascination and repulsion. They tell of men who, outside of battle, were calm and respected, but who, upon entering this feverish state, became unrecognizable. This duality is what makes berserkers so intriguing. They were both heroes and monsters, bearers of glory and terror. This pre-rage served as a kind of mystical warm-up, preparing the body and mind for the full impact of the berserking. And if this story surprised you, and if you're fascinated by this mysterious force that transformed men into legends, leave a like so this epic story can reach more people. Help spread this knowledge to those who love Norse history, and of course, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this saga. What other story would you like to see here? Leave your suggestion in the comments. And tell me, where are you watching this epic journey from? Your participation helps strengthen our community. While most sagas attribute berserker rage to a divine gift from Odin, modern science and some historical theories offer a more earthly explanation for this trance-like state. One of the most intriguing hypotheses is that the rage was induced, at least in part, by the use of hallucinogenic substances. The most popular theory suggests that berserkers consume the Amanita muscaria mushroom, known as the fly agaric. This mushroom, which was common in Scandinavia and Siberia, has psychoactive properties that could explain the symptoms of the rage. Consuming Amanita muscaria can cause a range of effects, including euphoria, sensory distortion, increased strength, and an insensitivity to pain. Saga accounts of battle fever, with tremors, panting, and salivation, match the symptoms of this mushroom intoxication. Consuming the mushroom could also explain the visions and hallucinations warriors allegedly experienced. In their trance-like state, they might see their enemies as monsters or dragons, which would compel them to fight with even greater ferocity. For berserkers, however, these visions were not hallucinations, but a direct connection with the gods, a confirmation of their divine mission. The mushroom theory, however, is widely debated and lacks concrete historical evidence. There are no direct accounts of Vikings consuming Amanita muscaria for the purpose of going into battle. Furthermore, the mushroom's use can be dangerous, with side effects such as nausea, convulsions, and even death. This raises the question of how berserkers controlled the dose and avoided adverse effects. Other theories suggest that the trance could be induced by other plants, such as henbane, or by a combination of factors, including alcohol consumption and mass autosuggestion. Regardless of its veracity, the hallucinogenic theory adds a new layer of complexity to the history of the berserkers. It forces us to question whether rage was truly a divine gift or merely a manifestation of natural knowledge. What is certain is that the mystery surrounding berserker rage is what makes it so fascinating. Was the rage the result of a spiritual connection or archaic plant knowledge? The answer may never be known, but the debate continues to fuel the legend of these warriors. Despite their fame and usefulness in battle, berserkers were not entirely welcome figures in Viking society. Their strength and invulnerability were admired, but the madness that accompanied them generated deep fear and distrust. The berserker, in his furious state, was a force of nature, an irrational creature uncontrollable. And in a world where social order and clan law were paramount, unpredictability was seen as a threat. When the battle ended, the rage didn't disappear immediately. The berserker could take time to calm down, and in this post-rage state, he could be dangerous to his own allies. The sagas, while often idealizing these warriors, also tell stories of berserkers who, after battle, would attack their own comrades or wreak havoc for no apparent reason. This uncontrollable madness, the inability to distinguish friend from foe, was what generated the greatest stigma. They were valued for their usefulness in battle, but were marginalized figures outside of it. The berserker was a paradox, a hero on the battlefield, but an outcast in everyday life. Viking society feared their strength. The myth of their invulnerability, while an advantage in combat, also made them fearsome to the general populace. A berserker could challenge a jarl, intimidate commoners, and even steal wives or property, relying on their reputation for strength and madness to avoid retaliation. This lack of control and respect for the laws of society led to them being viewed with a mixture of respect and contempt. Viking society, though warlike, was governed by a complex system of laws and traditions. The berserkers' fury, which defied order and law, was seen as an aberration. They were the lone wolves of a world of clans and families. This tension between the need for strength in battle and the fear of its unpredictability outside of it is one of the most fascinating aspects of their history. The berserker was proof that brute force, unchecked by reason, was as dangerous to allies as it was to enemies. Berserker rage, despite granting superhuman strength and apparent invulnerability to pain, came at a high price. The berserking state was such a drain on energy that, after combat, the warrior would enter a state of profound physical and mental exhaustion. The sagas describe this moment as a hangover of rage, where the berserker became weak and vulnerable, a shadow of the fearsome warrior he had been minutes before. It was a dangerous moment, requiring the protection of his companions, as he no longer had the strength to defend himself. This exhaustion was the result of a massive adrenaline rush and intense physical activity. The body, which had functioned at its maximum limit during the rage, now needed to recover. The warriors, who seemed immune to pain in battle, felt every wound and cut with redoubled intensity. What had been merely a scratch in combat was now a painful wound requiring treatment. The body, which had ignored the pain, now felt it with full force. This hangover also manifested itself mentally. Madness and rage gave way to deep depression, a feeling of emptiness and exhaustion that could last for days. The berserker's fragility after battle was a secret he and his companions kept. They were champions in combat, but they needed care and protection when the danger passed. This paradox is what makes the berserker a tragic figure. He was a hero who paid for his fury with profound suffering. The price of strength was vulnerability, and the price of madness was exhaustion. It was a journey of highs and lows, of glory and pain. Physical and mental exhaustion was also one of the reasons for the social stigma surrounding berserkers. Their unpredictability after their rage made them dangerous, and their fragile state made them a burden to their allies. Rage was a powerful tool, but one that could only be used cautiously, as the price to be paid was high. The history of berserkers is a story of glory, but also of sacrifice. And the exhaustion that came after the rage is what reminds us that, behind the legend, there were men who paid a high price for their power. Despite their unpredictability and social stigma, berserkers were an invaluable weapon in Viking armies. Their fury and apparent invulnerability were not just a spectacle, but a carefully orchestrated tactic. They didn't fight like the rest of the army. Their role was specific and crucial to the success of the battle. Berserkers were the Viking shock troops, the vanguard of the attack, used to break through the strongest defenses and sow chaos within the enemy ranks. In a Viking battle formation, the front line consisted of shield-bearing warriors, forming an impenetrable shield wall. Berserkers, however, did not fit into this formation. They were placed at the front, alone or in small groups, and their mission was simple: to break the enemy shield wall. In their fury, they attacked with a ferocity that made them unstoppable. They employed no complex tactics or strategies. Their sole mission was destruction. They rushed forward, ignoring the rain of arrows and sword blows, and attacked the defense line with brutal force. The impact of a berserker attack was devastating. A single berserker could breach a shield wall, creating an opening for the rest of the Viking army to enter. The sight of a seemingly invulnerable man, who moved with the strength of a bear and the momentum of a wolf, was enough to break the morale of enemy soldiers. Rage was a psychological weapon. Enemies, seeing that their weapons seemed to do no damage, would panic and flee, breaking formation and becoming easy targets for the rest of the Viking army. The use of berserkers as shock troops shows that the Vikings didn't view rage as mere madness, but as a strategic tool. They knew that a berserker's unpredictability was an advantage in battle, terrifying the enemy. Berserkers were, in essence, the manifestation of brute force at its peak, a force used for a clear purpose: victory. Their presence in a Viking army guaranteed that the battle would be short and brutal, and that victory, though costly, would be achieved. The berserkers' reputation for invulnerability and ferocity wasn't limited to the battlefield. Many Viking jarls and kings, recognizing the usefulness of these warriors, employed them as their personal guard. The idea was simple: if a berserker could break through a shield wall, he would certainly be able to protect his leader from any attack. Using berserkers as royal guards was a symbol of power and status. Having a berserker at your side was like having the protection of a mythological creature, a guarantee that no one would dare challenge your authority. Sagas, such as the Saga of Grettir the Strong, mention berserkers acting as bodyguards. They were feared and respected, and their presence was enough to intimidate any potential assassin or traitor. Their loyalty, however, was a matter of convenience. The berserker was loyal to a king not out of conviction, but out of pact. He fought for his leader in exchange for riches, honor, and, most importantly, the freedom to be who he was. The king, in turn, accepted the berserker's unpredictability in exchange for his unwavering protection. It was a relationship of mutual dependence, a compromise between reason and madness. The role of bodyguard was one of the few in which the berserker could use his rage in a controlled manner. He didn't need to enter a trance every moment. His mere presence was enough to deter danger. However, when an attack came, the rage was unleashed in full force. The story of Grettir, for example, tells of a berserker who challenged a jarl and was defeated, showing that even the berserker's rage was not invincible. The fight between the jarl and the berserker is a classic example of the tension between the order of society and the chaos of rage. The use of berserkers as royal guards, though risky, was a testament to their worth. They were a kind of special force, used only when the situation demanded maximum brutality. They were the last line of defense, the guarantee that the leader would be safe. This was a way of harnessing the berserker's madness for the good of society, demonstrating that even the most chaotic force could be tamed and used for a purpose. The presence of a berserker in a Viking army was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there was a deep respect for their courage and a sense of security that came from having a seemingly invincible warrior in their ranks. Berserkers were seen as Odin's favorites, and fighting alongside them was almost like fighting alongside a god. Their fury ensured that enemy defenses would be breached, and victory, however bloody, would be achieved. They were the embodiment of the Viking warrior ideal. However, respect was overshadowed by visceral fear. The berserker's fury knew no difference between friend and foe. The sagas, while telling of their glory, also recount incidents where berserkers, in their trance-like state, attacked their own comrades. Their madness was unpredictable, and the fear of being the next to be attacked was a constant. The common Viking warrior might fight alongside a berserker, but he kept a safe distance, hoping the fury wouldn't turn against him. The legend of a berserker being cured of his fury by an ally's sword was a common fear. Fear wasn't limited to the battlefield. Off it, the berserker was an outcast. Their madness rendered them incapable of fitting into society. They were seen as loners, unable to connect with others, and many lived on the margins of society, feared and isolated. Their strength was desired, but their presence was feared. Their life was one of glory and isolation, one of madness and loneliness. This duality, this mixture of respect and fear, is what makes berserkers so complex. They were both heroes and monsters, the thin line between civilization and chaos. They were the manifestation of what was most savage in the Viking world, and their existence was a constant reminder that civilization was fragile and that madness was always lurking. The age of the berserkers, despite their enduring legend, did not last forever. Their decline was gradual and driven by two powerful forces that transformed Viking society: the rise of Christianity and the evolution of warfare. As Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the ancient pantheon of Norse gods, including Odin, lost its influence. The Christian Church, with its emphasis on order, law, and control, viewed berserker rage as a demonic manifestation, a pact with evil forces. For the Church, the trance state was not a divine gift, but a possession of evil, and berserkers were seen as creatures of hell. Christianity brought with it the idea that violence should be used sparingly in the name of God, not in the name of uncontrollable rage. Berserker madness, the embodiment of chaos, had no place in the new Christian order. Laws began to be written down, and berserking was criminalized. Rage was no longer seen as a state of being, but as a dangerous madness that should be punished. The transition from the oral culture of sagas to written laws contributed to the marginalization of berserkers. Their story, once celebrated in song, was now recorded as a danger to be avoided. At the same time, war tactics also evolved. The Vikings were no longer merely raiders. They became settlers and warriors who faced large-scale organized armies. The berserkers' shock tactics, while effective against unprotected villagers, were less useful against well-trained and disciplined armies. Uncontrollable rage, which in a chaotic battle was an advantage, in an organized battle was a disadvantage. A berserker, unarmored, was an easy target for an archer or a spear. The new order of war demanded discipline, not madness, and the berserkers, in their uncontrollable madness, did not fit in with it. The decline of the berserkers reflected the decline of paganism itself and the tribal form of warfare, the figure of the solitary. Unpredictable warrior was replaced by the disciplined soldier, loyal to king and god. The age of the berserkers came to an end, but their legend, terrifying and inspiring, lived on, echoing through the centuries as a reminder of a time when the line between man and beast was blurred, and fury was a gift from the gods. The transition from the Viking Age to the Middle Ages in Scandinavia was not only a cultural and religious process, but also a legal one. The rise of written law and the influence of Christianity had a direct impact on how Viking society dealt with the phenomenon of berserker rage. The sagas, which once celebrated the madness of berserkers, were replaced by legal codes that criminalized it. A notable example of this is the Icelandic laws, which were crucial in the banning of berserking. In Iceland, the absence of a central king and the reliance on a communal legal system made the need for social order even more urgent. The GRGS, the 12th century Icelandic law code, is one of the earliest sources to document the criminalization of berserker rage. The law not only condemned the act of going berserk, but also penalized those who behaved irrationally or dangerously, even when not engaged in combat. Berserker rage was seen not as a gift from Odin, but as a dangerous madness that threatened the peace and stability of the community. Icelandic law, in particular, treated berserkgangr as a form of crime. A berserker who entered a trance and caused harm, even if not fatal, could be banished from society, one of the worst punishments in Viking culture. Banishment meant the person became an outcast, without protection from their family or clan, could be killed by anyone without punishment. This legislation was a way for society to protect itself from an uncontrollable force. Rage, once celebrated, was now seen as a mental illness, a threat to the well-being of the people. The criminalization of berserking was a crucial step in the transition of Viking society. It marked the end of an era in which brute force and madness were accepted, and the beginning of one in which order and law were the rule. Icelandic legislation is proof that berserker rage was no longer seen as a sacred force, but as a dangerous madness that should be suppressed. After centuries of idealization and folklore, the figure of the berserker has come to be seen in a new light in the modern world. Science and psychology offer a different perspective on berserkerism, suggesting it could be a medical or psychiatric condition. The most widely accepted modern theory is that berserkgangr was not a gift from Odin, but a form of hysteria, epilepsy, or mental disorder. War hysteria, for example, is a psychological condition that can be caused by the stress of combat and fear. A soldier, faced with a life-threatening situation, may enter a state of dissociation where he disconnects from reality and becomes insensitive to pain. This condition, known in wars of all eras, may explain the invulnerability of berserkers. They were not immune to pain, but simply did not feel it. Battle fever, with its trembling, panting, and rage, could be a symptom of a hysteria attack. Another theory, though less popular, is that berserkers were a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can cause seizures, hallucinations, and a feeling of euphoria. The brain's temporal lobe is responsible for emotions like anger and fear, and an epileptic seizure in this region could explain the berserker's uncontrollable rage. However, the lack of historical evidence for this theory makes it less likely. The theory that rage was a mental illness strips away the mystical aura of berserkers, but makes them even more fascinating. It forces us to question whether berserkers were heroes or sick people, whether their rage was a gift or a curse. Was the berserker an elite warrior or a man suffering from a neurological condition? The answer may never be known, but the debate continues to fuel the legend of these warriors. They were proof that the line between sanity and madness was thin, and that the power of the mind could be as terrifying as the power of the body. And if this story surprised you, and if you're fascinated by this mysterious force that transformed men into legends, leave a like so this epic story can reach more people. Help spread this knowledge to those who love Norse history. And of course, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this saga. The history of the berserkers, though rich in sagas and legends, lacks solid archaeological evidence. Most of the information we have about these warriors comes from literary sources, which, while valuable, cannot be entirely reliable. Historians and archaeologists continue to search for any physical remains that might prove the existence of these elite warriors and their rituals. The search for evidence is challenging, as most berserkers fought without armor, making them difficult to find in graves. However, archaeology has provided us with some clues that, while not conclusive, give us a glimpse into the reality behind the legend. One of the main areas of research is the search for graves of warriors who may have been berserkers. It is believed that these warriors in life were buried with their weapons, and that their graves held special significance. Some graves found in Scandinavia contain weapons and other artifacts that may be linked to berserkers. But the lack of a pattern or clear identification makes this theory difficult to confirm. Another area of research is the search for evidence of hallucinogenic substances in archaeological sites. The Amanita muscaria mushroom theory, for example, could be proven if we find traces of mushrooms at sacrificial sites or in graves. However, the fragility of mushrooms and other plants makes this search nearly impossible. What remains is the search for indirect evidence, such as the presence of bear or wolf skins in graves, which may indicate that the warrior belonged to this elite class. Archaeology, despite its challenges, remains a vital tool for understanding the berserkers. Their history, though rooted in legend, can be proven through the study of bones and artifacts. The lack of direct evidence, however, is what maintains the mystery surrounding the berserkers. They were such a chaotic force that they left no clear trace in history. Their story is told in sagas and legends, and their search for evidence is one of the most fascinating in Viking history. What we know about berserkers comes almost entirely from Icelandic sagas. These texts, written centuries after the Viking period, are our primary window into the world and culture of these warriors. Sagas, such as the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson and the saga of the Inglings, are a blend of history and folklore, fact and fiction. and their analysis is crucial to understanding the Berserkers. They are not historical documents in the modern sense, but epic narratives celebrating the heroes and deeds of the past. Analyzing the sagas allows us to understand how Viking society viewed Berserkers. They described them with a mixture of admiration and fear as heroes and monsters. The sagas detail their fury, their invulnerability, and their role in battle. They also offer insight into the darker side of their history, such as their madness and social stigma. What is most fascinating is how the sagas portray the transition of society. They show the struggle between paganism and Christianity, between fury and order. However, relying on the sagas as a source has its limitations. The sagas were written by Christians who, while admiring Viking culture, viewed paganism as a form of idolatry. This means that the image of berserkers may have been altered to fit a Christian narrative, where rage was seen as demonic possession rather than a divine gift. Analyzing the sagas requires careful reading, one that distinguishes history from folklore. The sagas, despite their limitations, are what keep us connected to the history of the berserkers. They are proof that the legend of these warriors was so powerful that it survived for centuries, even after their era had ended. They are the legacy of the berserkers, their story told by those who saw them in action. The legend of the berserker does not end with a grand event, but with the image of a last solitary warrior. The story of the berserkers is one of glory and tragedy, and their end is one of melancholy. The legend of a last berserker is a recurring theme in popular culture, a symbol of the end of an era. This warrior, who does not fit into the new, organized Christian world, meets his end in an epic battle, alone and without the glory of his past. The final scene of an epic script might show this elderly berserker in a final battle against an army of Christian soldiers. He no longer fights in the name of Odin, but in the name of the memory of an era that no longer exists. He is a relic of the past, a ghost of an age of chaos and fury. The battle is brutal, and the berserker, despite his age, is still a force to be reckoned with. However, the new order of war is stronger. He is defeated not by force, but by strategy. The spears and arrows of the Christian soldiers, which he previously ignored, now strike him. His invulnerability is no longer enough. The death of the last berserker is the end of an era. His death symbolizes the transition from paganism to Christianity, from madness to order, from fury to discipline. The berserker, who in life was a force of nature, in death is just a man. His story, however, lives on, a legend told by those who remember what he represented. The final scene is one of respect and melancholy, a farewell to an age of heroes and monsters, of chaos and glory. The disappearance of the berserkers was not just the end of a warrior breed, but the end of an era. Their existence, rooted in paganism and mysticism, was a reflection of a world about to change. The berserkers were the embodiment of a form of warfare that was more than a battle. It was a ritual, a pact with the gods. They were the embodiment of brute force, madness, and glory, and their fury was the engine that drove Viking expansion. However, their era came to an end. The rise of Christianity and changing warfare tactics rendered their form of combat obsolete. The berserker, who in a chaotic battle was a hero, in an organized battle was a liability. Their fury, once celebrated, was now feared and criminalized. Their figure, once one of admiration and respect, was now one of fear and contempt. Viking society, once based on strength and fury, was now based on order and law. The age of the berserker was replaced by the age of knights, soldiers, and kings. The story of the berserkers is a reminder that history is a cycle of change and transition. Their story shows us that violence, however glorious, has a price. The berserker, in his fury, represented the most savage in human nature. Their legend, however, lives on, an echo of a world that no longer exists. They were the last warriors of an age of chaos, and their story is the story of a world on the verge of becoming civilized. Not every berserker met their glorious end in battle. The fate of the survivors is one of the most tragic and least explored aspects of their history. The new order of Viking society, now more Christianized and organized, no longer had room for warriors who gave in to madness. Those who survived the battlefields found themselves in a world that viewed them with fear and distrust. Berserkers who didn't die in combat were forced to adapt. Many became outcasts, living on the fringes of society, isolated and feared. Their madness, once a gift, was now a curse. They couldn't marry, have children, or lead normal lives. Their reputation for unpredictability made them dangerous to society, and they were often banished from their lands. The law, which now criminalized berserking, forced them into exile. The life of a surviving berserker was one of solitude. They could no longer indulge their rage, and the lack of purpose in their lives drove them to profound exhaustion. What had once been their strength was now their weakness. The legend of the berserker is one of glory and tragedy, and their story is that of men left behind by a society that had changed. They were the relics of an era that no longer exists, the ghosts of a war they could no longer fight. The survivor's story is a reminder that violence, however glorious, has a price. Their story shows us that rage, however powerful, cannot last forever. They were the last warriors of an age of chaos, and their story is the story of a world on the verge of becoming civilized. The history of the Berserkers is more than just a story of legendary warriors. It's a story of a clash of cultures and tactics. Although the sagas tell us about their battles against Saxon and Anglo-Saxon armies, the idea of a berserker facing the discipline and organization of an army like the Roman or Frankish is fascinating. The clash between fury and order, between chaos and discipline, is one of the most compelling in history. The Roman armies, with their iron discipline and testudo formation, were the opposite of Viking tactics. The Roman shield wall, with its organization and discipline, was a force that could not be broken by the fury of a single warrior. The Berserkers, who were unstoppable against the disorganized formations of the Saxons, would be easy targets for the Roman soldiers, who used their spears and swords to kill from a distance. Fury, which was an advantage in a chaotic battle, was a disadvantage in an organized one. The clash between fury and order is one of the most recurring themes in history. The madness of the Berserkers, which was their strength, would be their weakness against an army based on discipline. However, the story of berserkers against organized armies is not one of defeat, but of respect. The Romans, with their admiration for courage, would have seen the madness of the berserkers as a form of bravery. They would have seen fury not as madness, but as a form of honor. The story of the berserkers against empires is a reminder that war is more than strength. It is strategy, discipline, and organization. Their story shows us that while rage is a powerful force, cannot last forever. Their story is a reminder that history is a cycle of change and transition, and that the age of the berserkers, though glorious, has come to an end. A berserker's fury didn't end with victory in battle. The aftermath of a berserker attack was as terrifying as the attack itself. While the rest of the Viking army was busy pillaging and dividing the loot, the berserker, still in his fury, continued to wreak havoc. They weren't interested in gold or loot. Their sole mission was destruction. The sagas, while speaking of their glory, also recount the terror they caused. They could destroy homes, burn farms, and kill non-enemies. Their madness was blind, and their destruction was random. The city, which had been conquered, was now a battlefield, a place of terror and chaos. The aftermath of a berserker attack was one of destruction and death, one of terror and chaos. The population, already terrorized by the attack, was now terrorized by the presence of an uncontrollable berserker. They were a danger to their own allies. Their madness was a curse that haunted them. The aftermath of a berserker attack is what reminds us that rage, no matter how powerful, has a price. Their story shows us that violence, no matter how glorious, has a price, and that their madness, once a strength, was now a weakness. Berserker rage, with its unpredictable and powerful nature, continues to fascinate historians. One of the most intriguing, though unproven, theories is that the condition could be a genetic trait passed down from generation to generation. The legend of entire berserker families, such as the Inglings, suggests that rage was not just a gift from Odin, but a part of a clan's heritage. The genetic inheritance theory is based on the idea that rage was a neurological or psychological condition that could be passed down from parent to child. Rage, in its most primitive state, was a response to the stress of combat, a way for the body to protect itself from danger. If rage were a genetic trait, it would explain why some warriors could become berserkers and others could not. Rage would not be a matter of choice, but of inheritance. However, the genetic inheritance theory has its limitations. The lack of archaeological evidence or direct reports makes it difficult to prove. Rage, in its nature, was a rare condition, and its transmission from generation to generation would be difficult to trace. The genetic inheritance theory, while fascinating, is more conjecture than historical fact. However, it forces us to question whether the Berserker was a hero or a victim of his own biology. The history of the Berserkers is one of glory and tragedy, and their search for evidence is what keeps us connected to their story. Their story is a reminder that violence, however glorious, has a price, and that their madness, once a strength, is now a weakness. And if this story surprised you, and if you're fascinated by this mysterious force that transformed men into legends, leave a like so this epic story can reach more people. Help spread this knowledge to those who love Norse history. And of course, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this saga. The decline of the Berserkers marked the end of an era of tribal warfare and the beginning of a new order in Scandinavia. Viking society, now more unified and Christianized, no longer had room for the solitary, uncontrollable warrior. Berserker of rage, once a pillar of warfare, was now a crime, a madness that must be suppressed. The warrior, once a god, was now a soldier, a servant of the king and god. The new landscape, however, did not mean the end of violence. War remained a part of life, but it became more organized and disciplined. Armies grew larger, tactics became more complex, and the warrior became a professional. The berserker, who in his madness was a force of nature, was replaced by the knight, who in his discipline was a war machine. The story of the berserkers is a reminder that war, while a part of life, is a reflection of society, and that their story is a reminder that violence, however glorious, has a price. Berserker rage, however, did not disappear completely. It continued to live on in legends and sagas, a reminder of a time when the line between man and beast was blurred. Its story is a reminder that the past, though a place of violence, is also a place of glory, and that its story is a reminder that rage, however powerful, cannot last forever.